What's up, guys? Hope you're having a great day. Today we're just gonna keep on keeping on with Reconstruction and the period right after the end of the Civil War. And I just want to remind you that this period is called Reconstruction because our country is going to have to rebuild itself. And not only are the southern states going to have to rebuild the cities and things that were destroyed during the war, but our country is really going to have to rebuild itself. And so, what I want to do today is I want to look at the different plans that people had for Reconstruction and what life was like for people in the South, particularly during Reconstruction. So, Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States during the Civil War, and he had two big goals during the Civil War. The first goal was to end the war as soon as he possibly could, and the second goal was to preserve the Union or bring the states back together. And because those were his main goals, he had a very easy plan for Reconstruction. In order for a state to come back into the Union, a southern state that had broken away or seceded, they had to do two things. The first thing they had to do is they had to pledge loyalty. 10% of the population had to pledge loyalty, which is a really, really small percentage of the state. And that's why it's considered an easy plan for Reconstruction. The second thing that they had to do is they had to ratify or pass the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment is what officially freed the slaves. So, in order for a southern state that had seceded to come back into the Union under President Lincoln's plan, 10% had to pledge loyalty and they had to free their slaves. And so we consider this an easy Reconstruction plan. Abraham Lincoln wanted it to be really, really easy. And that was all fine and wonderful until he was assassinated. Abraham Lincoln and his wife went to see a play at Ford's Theater. And as they were watching that play, John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southern guy who did not like Abraham Lincoln, snuck up into the booth and he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And so Abraham Lincoln died, and with it, or with his death, came the death or the end of an easy plan for Reconstruction. And so things probably would have been easy for the southern states to come back into the Union if Abraham Lincoln had not been killed. But because he was killed, this guy becomes president. Andrew Johnson was the vice president at the time, and Andrew Johnson takes over when Abraham Lincoln dies. And Andrew Johnson has a much different plan for Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson did not want an easy plan for Reconstruction. In fact, he wanted it to be difficult for the southern states to come back in. And so one of the things that Andrew Johnson wanted to do is he wanted to kind of humiliate or embarrass the white Southerners that belonged to the Confederacy. And the reason he wanted to embarrass them is because Andrew Johnson actually grew up in the South. And Andrew Johnson growing up in the South was actually really poor. And so as he was growing up, the white Southerners who were rich would give him a hard time, kind of pick on him and that kind of thing. And so once he became president of the United States, he used that as kind of an opportunity to get back at those rich people who had picked on him. And so he wanted to humiliate those white Southerners. And so what he would do is he would make them ask for a pardon. And a pardon is essentially asking for forgiveness. And so he would make those Confederate white rich people from the South ask for forgiveness for the Civil War. And some of them actually had to go to Washington, D.C. and ask for a pardon. And so it was really, really embarrassing. And that's one of the things that Andrew Johnson did. Now, one of the things that Andrew Johnson agreed with Abraham Lincoln on is he wanted the states to pass the 13th Amendment, which again freed the slaves. So Andrew Johnson did believe that the southern states should have to free the slaves. But Andrew Johnson did not believe that the slaves, the African Americans, should be considered citizens, which is what the 14th Amendment did. The 14th Amendment said that African Americans should be considered citizens, and Andrew Johnson did not think that African Americans should be considered citizens. And it goes back to his roots as a white Southerner growing up. So Andrew Johnson had a much more difficult plan for Reconstruction. He wanted to humiliate the Southerners. He did want them to pass the 13th Amendment, but he was against the 14th Amendment, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, caused Congress to really disagree with Andrew Johnson. So that's kind of Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. I want to talk to you a little bit about life for some of the people who were in the South after the Civil War. And let's start with the white Southerners. After the war, after they lost the war, they were really kind of angry. And they didn't want to lose the kind of life that they had. And so they wanted things to return to normal. They didn't want to just give up slavery. They didn't want to just give up all of those things that they had had for so long. And so they wanted life to try to go back as normal as possible. So some of the things that they did is they would run for office. And so white Southerners would run for office. And if they were elected, then they could kind of try and make life return to the way it was. Another thing that they did is they found these ways to treat African Americans unfairly. So African Americans and slaves were forced to become free. So they were free, but just because they were free, they weren't treated equally, especially in the South. And so what they did is they passed these things called the Black Codes. And so what the Black Codes did is it stopped African Americans from doing certain things. So like one of the things is they couldn't own guns. So it prevented them from owning guns. They couldn't own land. The Black Code stopped them from taking certain jobs, and it stopped them from being educated in many different ways. And so the white Southerners, what they did is they passed these kind of laws to stop them from having all of these things, and it made life really, really difficult for the African Americans. So one question to think about is, even though the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, were they really free? Some people might say yes, because they don't have to be slaves anymore, but some people might say no because of these Black Codes and because of the fact that they still weren't treated equally in the South. And so what's going to happen is a lot of African Americans are going to try to leave the South, which we'll talk about later. Another interesting thing that happened for white Southerners after the Civil War is because they didn't have slaves anymore, a lot of them became really, really poor. They lost all of their workers. And so because they became poor, a lot of them had to do what we call sharecropping. They had to become a sharecropper. And the way that sharecropping works is it's where two people share the land. So somebody might own the land. And so instead of having slaves, they might hire a white Southerner to come work on the land. And so then they get to split the crop. So it would be like if I owned land, but I lost all my slaves, and somebody else lost all their slaves and they were poor, that person coming and working on my land, I give them a place to live, and then we split the crops that we grew. And so that was called sharecropping. So sharecropping was another thing that a lot of white Southerners had to do after the Civil War. So that was what life for white Southerners. I want to talk to you about one more group that tried to create a Reconstruction plan, and that was Congress. So we had Abraham Lincoln's easy Reconstruction plan. We had Andrew Johnson's difficult Reconstruction plan, and now the Congress of the United States is going to have a different plan for the South during Reconstruction. So one of the things that Congress did is Congress tried to stop the white Southerners from electing one another for office. Another thing that they did is they created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was this group that was established to help the newly freed slaves in the South after the Civil War. And so the Freedmen's Bureau helped slaves get money, helped slaves get jobs. One of the things you might hear is 40 acres and a mule, which is something that Sherman came up with, but what it essentially did is it gave African Americans some land and some animals, so like 40 acres and a mule. So the Freedmen's Bureau was put in place to help African Americans after the war. And so what we call the United States Congress, what we call their plan for Reconstruction was radical Reconstruction. Radical means to change, and so they were really trying to change the South. And so what Congress actually did is Congress sent troops down into the southern states to try and force the southern states to behave. They sent other people that we call radical Republicans. And what radical Republicans were people from the North who were essentially sent south by Congress to try to make sure that the South was doing what they were supposed to be doing, that they freed the slaves, that they passed the 14th Amendment. So the United States Congress liked the 14th Amendment. Remember, Andrew Johnson did not like the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, again, says that African Americans should be citizens of the United States, are citizens. So, because Andrew Johnson did not want to pass the 14th Amendment, and because the United States Congress did want to pass the 14th Amendment, they actually impeached Andrew Johnson, which means they tried to kick him out of office. They tried to get rid of him as the president of the United States. Now, he actually won the vote by one vote, so he wasn't kicked out of office, but he was the first president to ever be impeached, which is the process of trying to kick the president out of the office. So that was kind of Congress's plan for Reconstruction. And so, like I mentioned, the group of people that they sent down south, we call radical Republicans. Those are the people from the North who came down south to try to make sure that the Southerners were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Two groups of people that you might hear about are carpetbaggers and scalawags. And I'll tell you what they are really quickly. A carpetbagger was somebody who came down south to make money after the war. And so Southern people really did not like the carpetbaggers. You can see that picture of one on the back of this slide. What they did is they knew that the Southern cities had been destroyed. They knew that the Southern people needed things. And so they came down south and they tried to make money. So they tried to sell them supplies and that kind of thing because they knew they needed it. So to be called a carpetbagger was not a good thing. So a carpetbagger was somebody who came from the North to try to make money in the South. And then another group of people were called scalawags. And a scalawag is a Southern person who supported the radical Republicans. So it would be like a Southerner who wanted to pass the 13th Amendment and wanted to pass the 14th Amendment. So both carpetbaggers and scalawags were kind of bad nicknames that you didn't want to be called by somebody. So the next two slides are kind of a summary, and they are the most important slides of the entire thing. And so we really have three plans for Reconstruction. The first plan is Abraham Lincoln's, which was an easy plan that the states had to, 10% had to pledge loyalty, and they had to pass the 13th Amendment. But he was assassinated. The second plan is Andrew Johnson's plan, which was more difficult. The white Southerners had to ask for forgiveness or pardons. But Andrew Johnson did allow Southerners to regain power and let life go back to the way it was in the South. And so the third plan is Congress, because they didn't like that Andrew Johnson was letting Southerners control the South again. And so they opposed Andrew Johnson. They sent radical Republicans down south, and they tried to force the Southerners to obey. And then life during Reconstruction was different for white Southerners and freedmen. White Southerners, a lot of them had to go to sharecropping because they were poor because they lost their slaves. They tried to run for office so that they could make life go back to the way it was. Treated African Americans unfairly, disliked carpetbaggers, and they disliked scalawags. Freedmen, which were newly freed slaves, had a difficult life during Reconstruction. They weren't treated fairly. They weren't treated equally. The Black Code stopped them from owning guns and land, and so they had a really hard time. But the Freedmen's Bureau was created to try and help them out. So that's essentially what was going on in the United States during Reconstruction. We had these three different plans for Reconstruction, and we had all these different things going on in the lives of the people down south during Reconstruction. All right, that's it for today. Hope you have an awesome rest of the day. Keep working hard. Thanks.